Well, welcome to the Helping Families Be Happy podcast, where we explore the often messy world of family love and relationships. I'm your host for this podcast, Christopher Robbins, the co-founder of Familias, husband, father of 9 children, author, fly fisherman, backpacker, and aspirational musician based in the beautiful Central Valley of California. We hope to bring you nourishing, real-life information about love, family, relationships, and life. Now, I am happy to introduce today's guest, Melissa Dalton Bradford, co-founder of 2 thriving nonprofits, consultant on intercultural integration, and frequent public speaker. Her written works from books, proud to say, Familias' Global Mom, a memoir on loss and living onward, 2 wonderful books that you need to explore, to online and magazine articles and anthropized essays and poetry, often address the intersection of loss and spirituality. Her speaking, she has addressed the UN, affiliate conferences, university forums, and international women's symposia, draws on her 30 years of parenting and serving in communities across 8 countries and 6 languages, possibly more, as we conduct this podcast. A graduate of Brigham Young University, a BA in German language and literature, MA in comparative literature, she has instructed language, creative writing, humanities on the university level. She and her husband, Randall, are the parents of 4 children, 3 of whom are living and currently reside just outside of Frankfurt, Germany. Still true, Melissa?
It is. It's still true, if you can believe it. It's the longest place I've ever lived anywhere in my whole life.
Where she rides on the edge of a dense, inspiring forest. Okay.
Yep. Where I was just walking until there was this huge cloudburst, and then I came running in and I had to dry my hair because it was really wet. That's why it's so green in Germany, because it's so rainy.
Well, that explains a lot, actually. So now we welcome you, Melissa. Thanks for joining us for this podcast. Now,
Thank you so much for just letting me come and talk with you again. It's been too long, and I owe you so much. And I love the mission of Familias, and I love the works that we've put out into the world together. And I've loved working with you.
You're definitely too kind. So, because what we know about the publishing world is that for every author, there's never enough publicity, and the royalty checks are never large enough. So,
you can say that again. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's talk about this international experience. So, with 35% of the general U.S. population considering moving overseas as of this year, 2025, we thought we'd like to explore living abroad and what we should know and anticipate if we want to have an international experience with our family. Now, for our listeners, today's discussion leans into all 10 habits of the 10 habits of happy families. And you can learn more about those Familias' 10 habits by going to the Habit Hub blog on familias.com. And for the video of this podcast, please go to the Familias YouTube channel. Now, Melissa, you wrote a book called Global Mom, where you literally had lived. Tell us again, how many different countries, how many different languages?
Okay, well, when we started that trajectory, and here's the book, by the way, I'm sure that you'll show you do the video, portion of this, but we had already lived in Hong Kong and Vienna as a couple before we then took the plunge, and we moved in the early 90s from the greater New York City area to Norway. And from Norway, we then moved to France, and we lived in 2 different places in France. We moved into Versailles, which is outside of France. Maybe some of our listeners have heard of Versailles and the big chateau there. Yeah, that's where we lived, not in the chateau, but not too far from it. And then we moved into the center of Paris, and then we moved to Munich, and then we moved to Singapore. I'm keeping track. And then we moved to Geneva. And at that point, that's where this book, Global Mom, kind of ends. But at that point, we were anticipating a move to where we live now. We've lived in 3 different places in central Germany, not very far from Frankfurt. So living here in and around the middle, Frankfurt in the center of Germany has been the longest continuous place I've ever lived anywhere, including the place where I considered my home in the United States, which was the Rocky Mountains. I had lived there for about 11 years continuously, but now it's been almost 12 years in one place. So since we published Global Mom, we have been living in one place. Long answer, but that's it. And what we've needed to do over all of those places, what we chose to do, and I advise everyone who's anticipating a move globally, is to make the commitment to learn the language quickly, especially for all of our English speakers out there. And I'm going to assume that's most of our listeners. If you're an English speaker, because it's a dominant language and it's very often the lingua franca wherever we might travel, or many places that we travel in the world, certainly not all of them, we can get by in English, right? But I often say to the people that I teach language to, I say, yeah, you can get by, but you can't get in. You can't really get into the heart of a culture unless you learn the language. So I'm a language teacher, and I've helped people from various backgrounds, business people and self-initiated expatriates, and primarily asylum seekers here in Germany. I've helped them get a kind of a leg up with the language, and it makes all of the difference for a number of practical reasons, but also for social reasons, obviously, for your sense of confidence and competence. And like I said at the beginning, getting in to the heart of a culture. Okay, so I just wanted to plug that at the very beginning. I'm sure you have a whole list of questions, and I'm going to do my best to answer them all, but that's a very important one. And that's something we tried to do in Norway, in France, in Germany, in Singapore. We have an Italian son-in-law now. His family doesn't really speak Italian, so we've been learning Italian. There we go. So we're about at 6 languages at this point, and counting.
Okay, so that was probably one question is over these years, it's been now 30 plus years
It's been almost 34.
and all these different countries and at least 6 different languages. Uh,
Yes.
so you've really had this international globe-trotting experience and can provide counsel and advice to our listeners about if they're considering this. Well, the first thing they need to know is if they want to get in, they need to study and learn and adopt this new language.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's just explore.
Okay.
What are some other things that you think someone should do if they're considering moving abroad?
I think the first thing you need to do is determine how you want to live abroad. Do you want to live in an enclave? Do you want to live in an American or a British or whatever enclave? That's certainly an option, and they're creeping up all over the place because so many people are moving abroad. Um, but how, do you want to integrate? Are you going? Are you going so that you're going to try and find work once you've arrived, or are you going to make sure that that's a decision that's already nailed in place before you go? And that's a very, very big one. Why is that big? Because your employment is going to determine whether you're going to be maybe supported by a larger entity, right? If you're working for a larger company, are they going to help you in any way when you arrive, or are you just going to pack your bags, arrive, and start looking when you're there? The second option, obviously, is much, much more difficult because you don't have an authorized visa to work. So all of those legal implications have to be taken seriously before you even really, um, before you even get those bags packed and
Before you
finished.
pack your bags, but better
Yeah, before
do
you pack
your
your bags.
research.
Yep. Yep. Do your research, do deep research. It is complicated. It is complicated and protracted. And for some people, it's very expensive to get a visa at all, to get a work visa, to get a residence visa. And all of those things are going to affect whether you can or how you can get housing. If you're taking children with you, we'll talk about that in a moment because that changes the picture considerably. What it's going to require of children, which has been our story, right?
And I would
But
assume that each country is different in terms of regulations.
yep, absolutely. There are some countries, I'll just name 2 of them, Spain and Portugal, that are much more welcoming from a logistic and a legal standpoint. They will fast track some visas from residency, that sort of thing. You'll have more support in that respect. There are going to be other countries that are far more hesitant to let non sponsored families in. They want to know that you have assured income. They want to know that you're insured medically, for instance, that you're not going to be a burden on the medical system. So all of those things are things that you have to study in depth before you pack your bags. Maybe you have some longing. You say, I want to live in the sun. I want to live near a beach. That's nice. That's really nice that you want to do that. Is there going to be some sort of a network that's going to even receive you and permit you to live in their culture? And how are you going to get schooling? And how are you going to get employment? How are you going to even get housing? All of those things are very important bullet points to put on your list before you make that commitment to move away from where you are right now.
Okay. So let's backtrack.
Okay.
I think the first place that you lived was Norway.
That's right. That's right.
So can you share, a story of what it was like, your very first experiences moving internationally and living in a different country, a different language, and what was that like?
Sure. And I'll just remind our listeners out there that I had already lived other places outside of the US, and it didn't frighten me. I had already lived in Austria. I'd been a full-time volunteer for my faith in Austria, as my husband had been. As I mentioned earlier, we'd lived in Hong Kong, we'd lived in Vienna. So the idea of kind of launching off into this unknown didn't frighten us so much. And we already spoke a language. We spoke German fluently. Okay. So I think that filed off some of the bristles, the fear that we would have had. But I knew nothing about Norway. I knew that it was cold and dark. And I knew that people probably skied a lot. I wasn't a skier, but I knew nothing. I didn't know a word in Norwegian. And we moved from the city that never sleeps, New York, to the country that was fast asleep. It was January and it was dark all of the time. And we had two little kids, a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. And as often is the case, you have one person who's going to be the employed sort of anchored person. The other one who was me was filling in all the gaps. And you have to do that in the native language. And I know that people now say, again, this is over 30 years ago. People say, oh, but all those Norwegians, they all speak English, don't they? Well, they do. And you could rely on that, but you're not going to get in. And I was determined to learn this language. So here's a story. Um, I my husband was traveling, and that's also often the case. He had responsibilities across Scandinavia. So there I was in the tundra with these two kids, and I needed to feed them. And I didn't know what the names of words were. And friends out there, this is before Google Translate, long before smartphones, long before any of those, Google Maps, nothing. So I had to trudge up a snowbank, up a hill to buy some food. And I had no idea how to buy. I thought, well, I'll buy pickled herring. Isn't that a Norwegian thing? Doesn't that sounds local? Okay. So I looked up in like a handheld dictionary that they're in museums now. They don't exist anymore. They were a little pocket dictionary that I carried around. And I looked up the word for pickled. And I looked up the word for, well, I thought I knew the word for herring. And I walked up to some man in this grocery store and I said in Norwegian to him, in broken Norwegian, do you know where, I thought I was saying pickled herring. Do you know where sur kjerring er? And he pointed to his wife. And they laughed, they broke out in laughter, and then they walked away. I didn't know that I had said, do you know where the crabby old, like, witch is? I didn't know that I had said. And they thought it was hilarious. There's so many word tragedies that we did. Another thing was we had no hope in finding, a home with much help from anyone. We didn't really have anyone that was going to help us find a place. So I was just driving across the countryside, trying to find a home for us to rent and live in. And that meant that within the first couple of months of living in this country, I had to read Norwegian newspapers and figure things out and have phone calls with people on in Norwegian. It just about cost me my sanity. I would go feral. I went feral. I was so scared to make these phone calls in a language that I could barely master. But we learned the hard way, and then we found homes, and we knew then how to how to buy pickled herring, and we integrated deeply.
It worked out. It
It
worked
worked
out.
out.
Okay.
Here we are. Here we are.
But, so then you had two children at that time,
Yes.
and then over the course of your life living abroad, you've had four children. So
Yes.
tell us in our audience, what do we need to know if we decide to bring our family along?
Okay. Very good question, because I've seen our kids adapt all across the age spectrum, from preschoolers all the way to their high school years and beyond. And we've also had married kids come back and live with us in Germany because they worked in Germany. So truly the whole spectrum. And as anybody who understands, developmental psychology and elementary education and middle school education, kids are going to respond to stress in different ways. What I would recommend is, if you have young kids, I would do everything I possibly could, and we did this and it helped us, it worked, to immerse them in the local system right from day one. So if you have a child that's under the age of 9, and for reasons that I won't go into, there's kind of a break-off point there of how children's minds and their learning capacity changes at about the age of 9. Just throw them into the local system. What happens then after that, about that age, is that depending on where you are, the school systems are very different. The French school system is radically different from the Norwegian system, which is radically different from the Singaporean system, and on and on and on. So the demands of the children are going to stress your kids in different ways. The Norwegian system was so soft and accommodating. The Singaporean system is much more stringent and much more exacting for kids. So we chose to put our littlest kids into local schools up until like somewhere when they're in grade school. And then we would sort of see how it went. We observed how kids, when they're then in grade school or middle school, and particularly high school, you almost have to make a choice. If they don't speak the language, you can lose a lot academically. You almost lose an entire year. So we were talking about differences with our children, and when we're moving with children and what it requires of children. And we found that up until a certain age, you can actually throw kids into the local schools. They will learn the language. Through them, you'll learn the language. You will get to know the other parents. You'll be introduced to the culture. It's a marvelous, marvelous method, natural method of learning the language and becoming integrated in the culture. When you get older, obviously the academic rigor, the academic demands are going to require that your children actually speak that language. And so it's a big thing. If you're thinking of traveling abroad and staying abroad for a long time, and putting your kids in schools, in the local schools, then you better have them speaking the language before you arrive, because it will be very, very difficult. Very difficult. They could lose an entire year or more in the academically. And the reason I can say that with authority is because I've been teaching here now for 10 years in Germany. I've been teaching asylum seekers from the Middle East and now from Ukraine. And I have worked with their kids as their kids become mainstreamed in German schools. And it's really tricky. I'm not going to minimize how tricky it is to have kids that are in their teens and older try to keep up with the academic load and learn a language at the same time. And some personalities can manage it. Usually extroverts and people who kind of let things roll off their back can manage it pretty well. But those kids that might have any tendencies towards anxiety or social anxiety issues, or might have any sort of learning need, a special learning need, I would think really deeply about what that means to move those kids. Of course, I've known people that have moved and they've continued to homeschool their kids as they've moved, and they've lived abroad for a while. So that's also an option. You have to remember, though, that in many countries, Germany as an example, homeschooling is illegal.
Mm.
It's illegal. So I don't know whether the German law can touch you if you are an American citizen and you're living here and you're just choosing to homeschool your kids, but that's something to investigate really deeply before you make those.
And again, living abroad, not suggesting, I mean, Michelle's homeschooled all of our children up until a certain age. But if we want to be in the culture, if we want to be in the country, having them have that full experience sounds to be really important. Um, Okay, so you talked about social anxiety. This is something that unanticipated. I want to ask the question. Um, do you feel like having this international experience, having going from country to country to country, having to be disrupted, having to learn new languages, have your children developed perhaps relatively a higher level of self-reliance or emotional resilience?
Yeah, it doesn't mean that it's all perfect. Doesn't mean that it's all perfect. And sometimes my husband and I have both sort of slapped our hands over our heads and we've said, "What did we do? What did we do?" Only because there is. Let me address one thing. I observe my dear friends that have lived in one place for 20, 25, 30, 35 years, and their kids have had the same librarian, the same clarinet teacher, the same teachers that have taken all of their siblings through school. And I envy that. And they kind of carry with them this sense of like they have this solid sense of identity, solid sense of who they are, because they're centered in their culture. They are right in the center of it. When you live as a non-native in a culture or several, you're aware of the fact, even if you speak the language fluently, which all of our family members have done, you're aware of the fact that you're on the periphery. You're aware of the fact that you're in the margins. And there is a kind of we've noticed this in our kids, you start to identify as, I'm the periphery guy. I'm the person who understands people in the margins, which isn't entirely a bad thing. My kids are deeply, deeply compassionate. They are so open to the guy or the girl who's out there on the edge. And so they're always looking for those people. At the same time, they don't know what it's like to be right in the middle of a culture. One of the positive things, though, and I've seen this from family after family after family after family, because I've worked a lot with what's called a third culture kid, and with those forums, we can talk about that in a moment if you want to. I've noticed that you do learn skills of adaptation. You're highly adaptive, highly adaptive. Like you can be a chameleon and you can find your place. And my kids have never once, when they went off to be volunteers for their faith or when they went off to be somewhere at university, never once said they were homesick. Not one time. Never. They've just said, I know how to make this work. I'm going to make it work. I'm going to find my way. I know how to slide into a new place. So, and that doesn't mean that they don't love their home. It's just that they know, oh, I know this feeling of being kind of destabilized or being um, uncertain about who my people are or how I function in this new place. But I think all of them to a person would say that's been a blessing for us. So long answer, but it's one of the great, great blessings of being culturally agile. Yeah.
Okay, so that's very helpful. Let's go back though. Is there something else we've talked about? Learning the language. We've talked about the legal regulations that we need to be aware of. We've talked about making sure that if we bring our children, we get them right in the culture. Is there something else that we're missing that we should know if we're thinking of living internationally?
Well, how long are you going to do it?
Mm-hmm.
Are you going with the intention of, I want to try this for a couple of years? I just want to see what it's like for a couple of years. Mentally, it might put you in a position where you don't commit. Might just say, I'm kind of going to be a tourist here for a couple of years. It's a very, very different thing to say, I'm cutting off ties. I'm going to find employment here. I'm going to go native. I'm going to go native. And it's interesting. The US military, many, many, uh, like 2, 3 generations ago, made the decision to move people regularly because they didn't want their military, their military people to go native. They didn't want them to become so committed, so entrenched in a new culture that they wouldn't want to move. They wanted them to be American. They wanted them to be mobile. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Are you going to commit to being in this place, this culture, this language? Are you going to do all of the hard, hard things that are required to make friends, to get employment, to learn the language if there is a language? If you're going to buy a place rather than rent, all of those decisions are going to spring out of your commitment. Let's go for a moment to property. It's not a given that you're going to be able to buy a property if you're not a legal resident with a long time residency permit. You might be able to rent, but you might not be able to buy. So you have to think about those financial implications too. Am I going to be renting indefinitely, or am I going to do what is necessary to get a residency permit in this country so that I can buy a place? And I know that people they do patchwork jobs. People do Airbnbs for an entire year, that sort of thing. But again, what is your mindset? Am I going to throw myself into this place and am I going to try and go local? Or am I going to treat this like a junket? Is it going to be a junket? Am I going to be here for a year or 2 years? So those are important things to keep in mind. One more thing, you haven't asked it yet, but this is very important for all of us that are coming to new cultures, is you have to have health care coverage. So if you're not invested in the legal tax system, then you need to have some other independent health coverage. And that can end up being very, very expensive. So that's another, again, these are kind of dry, unromantic points that you need to look at, but they're important points. Schooling, housing, employment, and healthcare. Those 4 things are absolutely vital to framing and defining what kind of experience you're going to have. And you have to have all of them, don't you? So
This is really helpful information. I hope our audience is listening and taking notes of what they need to research as they think about living abroad. Now, Melissa, you've done this for 34 years.
yeah.
Share with us, for you and your husband, what has been like what you think the most important positive experience that you've gained from these years? And are there any regrets of raising a family over all these different countries and different languages?
Let me start with the regrets first, then I'll end on the happy note, okay? Okay. The regrets are exactly that thing. I'm jealous. And sometimes almost regretful when I see other, all of our kids are adults now, but I see people who have had the kind of stability, the kind of predictability, the kind of support group, the kind of access to, people who have known, doctors who've known you your whole life long. You don't have to translate all of your medical records from language to language to language and start all over again with a new doctor someplace. Just think about that. I've had to translate all of our medical records 6 times, and I've had to try and help doctors understand what that child's medical concern was or what my own medical concern was. And that takes a lot of energy, But of course, our situation is one where we've been moving country to country to country. Not everyone is going to be moving country to country. They might just go to one place. So if they're going to one place, they dig down deep. They're going to translate their record once, and then they're going to have this experience of trying to dig deep in that one place. So that's one of the hard things that we've experienced. Obviously, another one is you're always leaving friends and you're always having to make new friends. And I've seen in my children's eyes sometimes this look of sort of vague fatigue, like I've got to do it again. And I love my friends, and I've put a lot of energy into building that relationship, and now it's all over again. We have to start over. So that's all of you people who've lived in one place for many, many years. Don't discount the kind of traction that you get when you live in a place for a long time and you're not interrupting it frequently. And those relationships are very, very important, not just with family. Some of you live around family. I've never had family. I've never had family when there's been crisis or birthday or holidays. I've had to create family everywhere I go. But that's the bridge to the thing that on the other hand, that's been the greatest blessing of this, Christopher, and all of our wonderful listeners out there, is that we have family everywhere in the world. Well, everywhere where we've lived. We have community. I feel at home when I go to Norway. I feel at home when I go to Paris. I feel at home when I go to Munich. I feel at home when I have people that I can gather, and they have expanded my worldview in ways that I just don't think any formal education could. In fact, one of the most famous German philosophers and authors, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who I wasn't planning on quoting in this podcast, but he happens to be from Frankfurt. He's like the German Shakespeare. He said, I'll say it in German, just so I can flex for everyone. Was ich mir nicht erlernt habe, habe ich mir erreicht. And that's what I haven't learned through formal education, I've learned through travel. So it's been an enormous education. And I feel that my heart has been stretched to include all of these cultures and these people. And that has been an immeasurable gift and blessing. And you can't get it as a tourist. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. You can like things on the surface as a tourist, but I often say the difference between touring in a place and residing in a place is the difference between window shopping and owning the dang store. I mean, when you're invested in a place, you sacrifice a lot for it, but the what you get back from that, the blessings they truly are immeasurable. So my kids to this day, if they were sitting right next to me and they were to pipe in on this podcast, they'd say we wouldn't have it any other way. We wouldn't, even though a lot of it was hard.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of it, yeah.
That's immeasurably helpful, and I'll flex my Goethe for you right now. So, and I appreciate you saying it in German. So, for our listeners, if you're thinking of living abroad, Goethe once said, "Whatever you can dream, begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it." So, there
You know what? I love you so much, Christopher. You just pulled that right out of the thin blue air, my friend. You speak to me. Yeah, that's right.
Everybody's brain works in a certain way, and mine works with things like that. So, Melissa, it's been so wonderful to have you join us. Now, in addition to reading your just fantastic memoir, Global Mom, which we recommend highly, where can our guests find you online?
You can find me on Instagram under MDB Global Mom.
MDB Global Mom.
All in lowercase, MDB Global Mom. That's where I am. I have a very deep, narrow social media presence. I'm not on TikTok. I'm not on Facebook, but I'm very, very active on Instagram.
Well, thank you again. Well, as we conclude today's podcast, I'd like to thank Familius for its support in bringing the podcast to your ears and your heart. We'd be thrilled if you subscribe to the podcast and left us a review. And if you're looking for more Familius books or content, be sure to visit us at familius.com, where you can find our Habit Hub blog and more amazing books and articles for families. You know, one step at a time, one country at a time, one culture at a time, we can make the world a happier place.